This video will show how to create the following two small C programs. First, creating a new C file in an empty directory, implementing it with a trivial program, printing the classical phrase "Hello World" to the screen. Then the Hello World program will be replaced with another program which receives input arguments from the command line and also receives keyboard input from the user. This video is part of at least one playlist showing how to do the above with different programming languages. There should be a link to that playlist in the description below. Prerequisites. You, the viewer of this video, are assumed to have some skills in at least some programming language. I will not explain basic concepts such as what is a variable or what is an array or what is a for loop. Even if you have never written source code with C before, you are assumed to be able to understand at least roughly with help of some comments. For example, what this C code below does. Of course, you can pause the video here. In this video I am using Windows 10 and I have installed MSys2 with the compilers GCC and CLang. The GCC version is 10.3. The CLang version is 11. The Windows command dir shows that I am starting with an empty directory. Now I create a new directory named C with the Windows command md and then navigate into it with cd. Then I start Visual Studio Code in that new empty directory by typing code and a dot, which is the path to the current directory. When Visual Studio Code has started, I create a new C file arguments_inputs.c in that new directory. In that file, I first include the file stdio.h from the C standard library to be able to use the printf function for printing output to the screen. Then I implement the main function with the two input arguments, which is C main function can receive. Those arguments will get their values when the program is started, for example from a command prompt. The first argument argc is an integer specifying the number of strings in the second argument, which is an array named argv. You can of course give those arguments any names, but argc and argv are very common names for the two arguments of the main function. In this first version of the program, I am not using those arguments, but will just print out a classic Hello World statement, just to verify that the installation of the compilers are correct and that they can compile this initial minimal program. You can print output to the screen with the C function printf from the C standard library when you have included stdio.h. The main function returns 0 or exit_success with capitals to indicate successful program execution. Now I will first compile with GCC and then I will also compile with CLang. Normally you would probably only use one C compiler, for example either GCC or CLang, but here I am using both of them just to show that it works with both of those two frequently used C compilers. The compilers GCC and CLang support many common flags such as wall and pedantic and std and O. The flag O is used for specifying the output file name. The flag std is used for specifying the C standard version. In this case I am compiling for the C99 standard, which are supported by both compilers. The flags wall and pedantic are used if you want to get more warnings about potentially bad code. In this very small program, no warnings are reported from any of the two compilers. Now when I execute the .exe file produced by the CLang compiler, you can see that it displays Hello World. Now I will replace this Hello World implementation with a program that will receive and print out arguments provided from the command line, and the program will also ask the user for keyboard input and will then print out to the screen what the user typed. For this purpose I have prepared some pseudocode which I will paste into the program, but within comments, since it of course would not be possible to compile. Then I will modify it by changing it into C code which can be compiled. The for loop is not iterated from the beginning, but the first item at index 0 is skipped, since it will be the program name. The program arguments start at index 1 in the array. Another thing to mention here is the argc argument, which is needed since the array itself does not contain size information when it is provided as an argument to the function. This is different from how it works in many other programming languages. For example, Java arrays have a field length, and C# arrays have a property count. But with C, it does not work like that. The length of an array can be calculated by using the size of operator when the array size is known at compile time, but it does not work when the array has been passed as an argument to a function, for example the argument to the main function. The reason is that the function argument becomes a pointer to the array, and it contains a position to the first element but not information about the number of elements, which is the reason for why we need a separate argument argc to specify the number of arguments. To receive user input text through the keyboard, we can use the function fgets from the C standard library. The first argument is a char array, which should be allocated with the maximum number of characters, in this case 10 characters. The maximum size is also provided as the second argument to the fgets function, with the size of operator. The third argument is the so-called standard input std_in, which usually is the keyboard as default. When a name has been received as input from the keyboard with the fgets function, it is printed to the screen with the printf function. Now I will compile the code. When the program is executed, you can see that it seems to work as expected. It iterates the arguments provided from the command line, and then it asks for a name, and when I type a name it is printed to the screen with hello as prefix. However, there is a problem with the implementation, which should be improved. I will now show the problem by trying to read into two variables with two calls of the fgets function. First, I reduce the size of the allocated array to 5 characters, which is exactly the number of characters I'm going to type when executing the program to illustrate the problem. Then I copy the code to do the same thing with a new variable and a new call to the fgets function. Then I compile the program again. When I execute the program and enters a name with 5 characters, you can see that only the 4 first characters seem to be received. And then the 5th character was put directly into the second name without showing a new input prompt. When the name array was declared, the allocated size was 5 characters. However, in C, char arrays, when used for representing strings, the last character is used for a so-called null character to specify where a string ends. Since the maximum size is 5, then only the 4 first typed characters are put into the array, while a null character is inserted into the last position of the array. It is indeed reasonable that when you type a long string, it is truncated into a string with the maximum length you have allocated for the array. However, it is not desirable, at least not in this case, that the remaining characters, which could not fit into the array, will be kept in the input buffer to automatically populate another array when you try to read again from the standard input. To avoid this behavior, we can keep reading from the buffer until it is empty, and then call fgets again to enter new input. I have prepared some code which will fix this problem and will now paste it into the code after the reading of the first variable. In the code you can see a \n and a \0. The \n represents the new line character and the \0 represents the null character. If the last character in the input string was the new line with \n, then it is replaced with a null character, \0. Else, if the input string was truncated before the new line character, then a while loop will keep reading from the standard input until the new line character is found, or if the standard input is empty. And by the way, the 3 letters EOF stands for end of a file. After that while loop, the input buffer has been cleared, so it can read the new input string properly, which you soon will see when I compile and execute the program again. You can also read the Stack Overflow page, which you can see here, and I will link to it from the description. Now when I compile, an error message is shown. The problem is that I need to include string.h, since I am now using the function strlen, which returns the length of a string. Therefore, I am now adding such an include statement and then compile again. Now I compile the modified program. And indeed, it now works as expected. Of course, the input strings are truncated into the maximum size 5 characters, which is 4 visible characters plus the null character. But the difference here, compared to when I tried previously, is that the remaining part of the first string is now thrown away, the letter S, instead of it being buffered and put into the next string when fgets is used again.